Let's continue our look at endgames, this time by going deep into various king and pawn positions. In our last lecture, we studied some overkill mates and then jumped into an esoteric exploration of the opposition with only kings on the board. You might have wondered, what in the world does this have to do with any kind of real chess game? But if you understood the opposition material we previously studied, I think you'll quickly realize that those apparently crazy king versus king situations weren't so crazy after all. Fortunately, even if you didn't fully understand the opposition, it is complicated, so please don't feel bad if that's the case. The examples here will help drive the point home. So let's jump right in and take a look at a king and pawn versus lone king position where basic opposition plays an enormous role. Here's an example of basic opposition, and it's a position that's appeared on various chessboards tens of thousands of times. Both sides' armies are gone, with white still having one little pawn as company. Of course, we know that pawns don't always stay little, and if white can turn the pawn into a queen or rook, he wins. If he can't, the game's a draw. White's only hope to win is to get his king in front of his pawn, where it will control the promotion square, so it can escort the pawn to the 8th rank. Black happens to have the opposition since white has the move, and white needs his king to advance if he wants to promote his pawn. At the moment, black's king is preventing this, so white moves to the side by king e5, and now black has 4 legal moves, but only one of them saves the game. Take a bit of time and see if you can figure out black's correct move. If white didn't have the pawn on f6, then black could retain the opposition by moving to e7. However, that's illegal. So black needs to use a bit of ingenuity if he expects to survive. Keep in mind that the battle is all about the f8 square. That's where the pawn will promote. If white can control it, he wins. If he can't control it, the game will end in a draw. And what is the means by which both sides will try and make their goal, controlling f8 a reality? The opposition. Let's look at all 4 black options. King g6. This is an instant loser since black's goal is to keep control over the queening square on f8. King g6 has nothing to do with that. King e6, white takes the opposition, king h7, and just simply king e7, and you're just pushing the pawn and making a queen. That was a disaster. So let's look again. Let's try king g8, another losing move. White advances his king to e6, taking the opposition. King f8, f7, the king has to leave the key square. White grabs the square, and next move makes a queen. If the kings are only 1 square apart, and if they face each other on a file or rank or on a diagonal, whoever moves does not have the opposition. Remember that. Since we still have 2 more legal moves for black after king e5, we already looked at king g6 and king g8. Let's see if we can verify this rule. King e8 loses because of king e6. Since whoever moves in these positions gets the worst of it, black loses after king f8, f7. He has to get out of there, and he loses. So that leaves black with 1 move, and that 1 move saves the day. King f8. Here, white would love to play king f6, getting the opposition, but he can't. He can't eat his own pawn. Thus, he has to go forward, and after going forward, black is able to step in front of the king. Black takes the opposition, and after f7 check, king f8, king f6, we have a draw by stalemate. These king and pawn versus king positions occur all the time, so it's critically important to know how to play them, and the only way to correctly play them is by the use of opposition. Let's look at a similar position. This position is a simple draw, but your opponents are going to make you prove it. As usual, it's all about the opposition. So, white moves his king, and black goes straight back. That's fine. That's actually a very easy move to play, but let's say black goes berserk and goes here. You don't want to do that, because after king e3, the king can't get back in front of the pawn, and it's all about the king being in front of the pawn. So he just goes straight back. King e3, and he doesn't let white's king come forward. It's very important, so he just gets in white's face. d4 check, then you step back in front of the pawn. King d3, and always go straight backwards. Here, if you went to the side, like here, it's still okay, but have good form. King d6, go straight back. That way, wherever he goes, you can step right in front of him. So, king e4, king e6, d5 check. And we repeat this straight backwards in front of the king so he can't advance. Straight backwards in front of the king so he can't advance. And if he moves his king again, you just jump in front of the pawn. Then straight backwards. And then finally, after you step in front of his king, he pushes the pawn, and he has no choice but to either move away and let you take his pawn or stalemate, draw. A word about chess engines. At the end of lecture 3, I said that chess engines are useful for playing over a specific endgame, and the position we just looked at is a perfect example. Set up that initial endgame position on your chess engine. Take the defender's side, in this case black, and see if you can draw it against the machine. Keep practicing it over and over until you can do it in your sleep. This will prove very, very useful. So, is opposition making more sense? Let's try another example. However, this time we'll put a bit of space between the defending king and the pawn. Once again, the opposition makes or breaks the side without it. Since it's white to move, black has the opposition and the game is a draw. King e3, king e5, f4 check, king f5, king f3, king f6, king e4, king e6, and we're back to our basic draw that we looked at previously. Black had no problem drawing in our last position, but if we take the exact same position but give black the move instead of white, meaning that white has the opposition, then black is doomed. Black moves, and that allows white to go forward. He moves back. Notice that if he goes forward, f4, and suddenly there's no way he's going to get in front of the pawn, and white will be able to escort the pawn all the way down. So, in this situation, black played king f6, trying as best he can to stay in front of that pawn. But white then regains the opposition, king f4, king e6, and we just go upwards. King e5, be careful you don't lose your pawn. f4 check keeps it close. If you keep going forward with like king g6, all of a sudden you're going to lose your pawn. So you keep an eye on that guy. That pawn's really, really important. f4 check, king e6. Now here is a very important move. You keep the opposition with king g6. You cannot play f5 check because you allow him to get in front of that pawn again, and that'll be a draw. So, king g6, king e7, now you have no choice, f5, king f8, and now the last hard move. Don't push the pawn, that'll be a draw. You go king f6, taking the opposition and forcing black to relinquish the key square where the pawn will promote. The king moves, you grab that square, and nothing can be done about this pawn shuffling right in to heaven. This position is the same as the one before, with the one difference being that white's pawn is on f2 instead of f3. White wins since he will be able to take the opposition no matter who has the move. The reason is that the pawn can switch opposition at the drop of a hat. White has to move. If the pawn was on f3, black would retain the opposition and draw. But since the pawn is on f2, white can turn the tables and go f3, when suddenly it's black to move, meaning white has the opposition, which means white wins. This leads to a useful thought. In a king and pawn endgame, It's often a good idea to retain an extra pawn move or two, since it might well enable you to grab the opposition. Let's look at a couple positions where the idea of the extra pawn move looms very large. Here's an example with multiple pawns. If white can step forward to the 6th rank, he'll be able to move to the side and capture a black pawn on b6 or h6, which is decisive. However, since it's white to move, black has the opposition, and the game is drawn since white's king can't make inroads into the enemy position. King d5, king d7, king e5, and you can see that because of the opposition, the king just can't make any progress. Thus, the game's a draw. This is the same position as the previous one, except for one tiny thing. White's h-pawn is on h2 instead of h3. Because of this, white has an easy win. Thanks to white carefully retaining that extra pawn move, he now is able to make use of it to steal the opposition and win the game. h3, and suddenly it's black to move instead of white, and white has the opposition. Black moves his king, white gets in front, he moves his king, and you just enter the position. And with the opposition, you just force the king away from the defense of its pawn. You attack the pawn, he guards it, opposition forces him away. He moves, you take the pawn, and white wins. Let's take a close look at the rook-pawn curse in king and pawn endgames. Rook pawns, pawns on the A and H files, are different animals than other pawns because there's only one file next to it, compared to other pawns which have files on either side. This creates many endgame exceptions, and king and pawn versus lone king is one of those exceptions. Normally, white would win with his king so far advanced, and he has the luxury of having quite a few extra pawn moves, which would seem to guarantee the opposition. But that missing file on the right makes opposition moot, and all black has to do to draw is to move back and forth between h8 and g8. Even more startling is the following position. Usually, when you're a pawn up and your king controls the queening square, it's a win for the superior side. But not here. Black is threatening to play king g8 when he gets that back and forth draw between g8 and h8. So white takes the h7 square. That should win, right? He controls the queening square. No, not even close. King f7, h4, king f8, h5, king f7, h6, king f8, and if king g6, king g8 is just a dead draw. So white continues keeping a hold of the queening square with king h8. King f7, h7, king f8, and oddly enough, it's a stalemate. The side with the material is stalemated, and the game is a draw. Rook pawns are so pathetic that really strange stuff occurs. I once saw an experienced player do the following atrocity. Knight to h4. This move is something you see in a horror movie. Black snapped it off, and after the take, the game's a draw. White is 2 pawns up, but the pawns aren't going anywhere. We can give white even more pawns, but the result will be the same. The overall lesson here is that rook pawns are often very drawish. If you're the defender, enemy rook pawns are often your friend. But if you're trying to win a superior position, rook pawns can be your worst nightmare. We saw that the result of king and pawn versus lone king depends on opposition. And we saw that rook pawns can, at times, change the nature of chess physics. But one would think that being up 2 healthy non-rook pawns would be a simple win. And that's correct. But if they're doubled, you have to be a bit careful. The correct way to handle our initial position is to pretend you only have one pawn. And when the game is about to come down to who has the opposition, use your other pawn to pass, and as a result, grab the opposition in the game. Here's how it's done. E6. Now, before we continue on that, let's have a look at something that doesn't really work for white. Let's say white tries to use both his pawns. So he goes E4, King D7, E6 check, King E5. Now he can still win with King E5, but instead, let's say he's just really into pushing these guys. King E8, King D6. And when we reach this position, suddenly there's a problem. King E6 is a draw, but if you push your pawn, the pawn actually takes away this square and it's still a draw by stalemate. So you really don't want to push both those pawns. So, returning to the game, we push the pawn to E6, pretending that we just have one pawn. King E8, King D6, King D8, E7 check, King E8. Now, normally this would be a draw because white would either give away his pawn or move here and stalemate. But white has this extra pawn, and so he just says, okay, it's not my move, now it's your move. And poor black has to get out of the way, and white grabs hold of the queening square, makes a queen, and wins the game. Our next example features no less than 3 important king and pawn endgame themes. All of them are extremely important, and you'll find yourself using them often as your chess years pass. The 3 themes are a queenside pawn majority, one pawn killing 2, the outside pass pawn. Let's break down each one of these. A pawn majority simply means one person has more pawns on the queen side, center, or king side than the opponent. In our position, white has a queenside pawn majority, 2 pawns versus 1. One pawn killing 2 is graphically demonstrated on the king side. Black has a kingside pawn majority, but white's one pawn on g5 is killing both black pawns, since if black tries to push his h-pawn to h5, white can capture en passant. Since the point of a pawn majority is to create a pass pawn, which ideally will turn into a queen, it's clear that white's way ahead since he can easily create that passer by a5. Black, though, can't create a pass pawn. An outside pass pawn means that the passer is outside of the main area of battle. White's plan is to rush his king into black's king side, eat the h7 and g6 pawns, and promote the g5 pawn. To do this, white will create an outside pass pawn on the queen side, which will force black's king to run to that side. That will give white's king free access to the kingside targets. King e4. Black's helpless, so white gets a bit closer to the king side. King e6. Notice, by the way, that if black tries to make a queen, that old en passant rule scuttles him. So, after king e4, he moves his king, trying to keep white's king out of his position. And now we push the pawn and create a pass pawn on the other side. He takes it, black's king has to run after the pawn. We push, black's king has to run after it. And now we make use of the fact that the king is on the other side of the board to rush in and eat up black's pawns on the king side. And black now desperately rushes back to the battleground on the king side, but it's too late. And the pawn rushes forward and makes a queen. Next up in our king and pawn endgame parade is something known as the square of the pawn. This is something you have to know, but fortunately, it's ridiculously easy to learn. Black to move. Can he stop this pawn? The pawn looks like it's far away. How would you know? Do you need to calculate? So, it's Black's move. Black played a hard game, and though he was in trouble for a while, one glance convinced him that if he managed to get this position, which he obviously did, he'd be able to draw it. That sounds impressive. Black saw at a glance that he was safe. What is he talking about? What's clear is that White's king is out of the fight, and everything comes down to whether or not Black's king can stop the a3 pawn from running all the way to a8. The Black king is far away too, so some serious calculation is necessary, right? No, no calculation whatsoever is called for, none. The truth is that all you need is that one glance to see that Black wins this race and draws the game. The tool he used is the square of the pawn. The way you can tell if Black's king is going to win that race is to simply draw a diagonal to the direction of the defending king. Thus, the line from a3 to f8. If you want to flesh it out, then f8 to f3 and f3 to a3 completes it. That's how you draw the square, a simple connection of lines. The rule is, if the king can step into that square, he can stop the pawn. So, our first question is, can Black's king step into the square? The answer is yes. He can move to f8, f7, or f6. All those moves achieve the goal. After that, you have to take it on faith that you're safe. But let's prove it. Black steps into the square, and the race is on. a4, king e7, a5, king d7, a6, king c7, a7, and just in time, king b7, queen check, gobble, draw. White to move, can Black stop the pawn? Yes, he can. After b5, the square is b5 to e8 to e5 here. And so Black can step inside that square with king e5, b6, king d6, b7, just in time, draw. It's White's move. So can Black save the game by entering the square? This is actually a trick, since White's a-pawn can use the two-move rule to ruin Black's plans. Instead of just moving one square, he's able to jump two, which totally changes the square. And Black can no longer get in it. And so he'll try, but it's not going to work out. Desperation. One move too late, and Black loses. The kings are facing each other. Try to figure out if White to move, what happens, and if it was Black's move, what would happen. Whoever moves fails. Once again, opposition is the law of the land. If it's Black's move, White has the opposition and he'll win. If it's White's move, Black has the opposition and Black draws. King e4, king e6, f4, and it's a basic draw. You might be wondering, does everyone know this stuff? They should, but a large number of tournament players don't. This is good news, since knowing these critical building blocks will give you a huge advantage over the unknowing rabble. Naturally, this material needs to be practiced, And I highly recommend that you do so with a chess engine. Stockfish is a very powerful chess engine, and it's free and available for Android and Apple phones and tablets. And there are several more elegant-looking engine apps too, though none of them have been stronger than Stockfish. By now, I think you realize that when an endgame appears, your first thought should be, I need to use my king. And after you voice that thought in your head, you'll likely feel a surge of empowerment, since not only do you know you need to use the king, but you also know how to use the king. If it's a basic mate, for example, king and rook versus lone king, you know that the king is a key player in that mating dance. And if you run into a king and pawn versus king position, chances are you'll perform at a high level, even with such a minimal army at your disposal.